Hey all, it's Fun Facts Friday. Thanks for tuning in. We have been spending the entire week talking about systems thinking and your development. What happens when you're a person who's individually investing in themselves, but the things around you may not be supportive or might actually be pulling away from your progress and your development. So that system around the culture you're in or the team you're on or the leader you have or colleagues, how is everything swirling around you in your performance environment impacting your personal development? So we've had a special guest all week, Roger Dugas, who is an OD expert and currently phoning in or zooming in from British Columbia, Canada, someone that I have had in my system for almost a decade, who I think has been a huge support in my own development as a friend and a mentor and sometimes a ping between the eyes coach. So thanks for joining us, Raj. So happy to have you here all week.
Thanks, Tonia. These are really enjoyable videos. I've been watching you on a number of them, and I think they're really helpful.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, today we take Friday a little lighter here for Fun Facts Friday, where I'll just share some interesting tips and facts and data around leadership development, particularly. And you and I have had the pleasure of building some world-class leadership programs together. Leadership development is really hard, as we know. And interestingly, a lot of programs lack effectiveness. Only 20% of organizations are reporting that their leadership development is effective, which is blows my mind when earlier in a fact we shared that the US alone spends $14 billion on leadership development annually and only 20% is effective. So I'd be really curious, like what you see there from a systems perspective, like how is that possible to have such a 20% being so low in terms of effectiveness?
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of money wasted. And honestly, I suspect that that 20% is probably 18 percentage points too high. I would like to know the context of how they're measuring the results. So if the result is 20% of people are saying we put leaders through a leadership program, then I can see 20% of people saying that, yes, we're successful. Because as you know, Tonia, from so many organizations that we've been with, is that they do measure their effectiveness by how many people actually attend a leadership course, or do we put people through a leadership course, which has nothing to do with learning. I mean, attending, as you and I always talk about, is not the same as learning. So, I mean, I suspect that that return of 20% effectiveness is a little bit high. But if I was a CEO, I would say the tip number one for me would be, how much am I spending in my organization, and what is my expectation? I think you start probably with expectation, and then you say, is that expectation something I can buy, or can I create that expectation here in house? But if you decide that you have to buy that expectation, I would want to be very clear on the elements of the product that I'm buying. So I suspect what you're doing when you're buying a development program is that you're buying an anticipated result.
Mm,
In other words, you want my leader to be able to do something very particular. You and I talk about this all the time. We just want them to coordinate all the resources in the direction of the goal and actually cross the goal line.
right.
That's really what I'm paying a leader to do. So many leadership development programs don't do that, which is why I suspect that my figure of 18 percentage points too high is probably more accurate. It sounds, it's a little bit comical and a little bit satirical, but I think it's closer to right. I've just seen so many bad leadership programs. It doesn't mean that the people who come out of them are bad leaders. Not at all. They were probably, if they were good leaders, they were probably good leaders going in. And
Mm.
so, the course did nothing to harm them, but did it do anything to actually develop them in the direction we want to develop? So, that's really interesting. But if you look at the figures, there have to be better ways to spend that money. We talked just yesterday about imitative learning. If you want your leaders to be good, show them what a good leader looks like and say, follow that leader around for a while and see if you can imitate what he or she is doing. And if you can, you could be a leader too.
And you too can be a leader.
Yeah.
I think that's great. You know, you're right. It's the context. And I think more CEOs, if I was spending that much money on leadership development and I was a CEO, I would be forcing effectiveness. And you and I have been there. Like we've been asked by, we've built these together as CEO and the board. How do we know we're getting this ROI? And we would measure it both ways. Like we would say, hey, we're going to measure a couple things. We're going to measure your direct investment. So how many of these people are leaving? Because if they walk out the door, that's X amount of dollars of an investment. And we would measure, so we would measure the retention, the actual retention of the investment. And we would also measure the movement of the investment. So not only how many people from the leadership programs were being promoted, but how did they perform at that next level? So we would look at, the promotion rate and their performance rate. So did that leadership development program ready them to be just as successful? Did we see a drop in performance, or are we able to sustain performance and move them up? And that's rare. I remember sharing that stuff with the board and they really appreciated it measured that way. And then we pull the qualitative stuff from looking at their 360s, down the road. So how are we seeing their behavior change over time? It's a lot of work, but that's the only way, I agree with you, to measure. They have to still be able to lead, right? Like it's not I just went through the class and it cost X. It's, did they do something different? Did they behave something different after the leadership program?
Yes, and I think leaders like CEOs have to be more involved in leadership programs. I know they're busy folks, and they always claim that they don't have time. But if you're thinking of investments of $14 billion, that's more than a lot of companies are worth. And I know that's maybe nationwide, but nevertheless, if I'm making any kind of investment at all, as a CEO, there are two things that are really important: uh, money and my leaders. And if you're spending a lot of money and it's not developing the leaders that you expected, I think that's something that they have to go and look at very closely on their own, and maybe not delegate it to somebody else, but really take accountability for developing those leaders and ask that CEO, him or herself, well, what was your best learning and your best development as a leader? And maybe imitate that.
Yeah. Great feedback. Raj, it has been awesome this week having you here and talking about systems thinking as an OD systems expert. I really appreciate you joining in these chats, and hopefully you'll be willing to come back and join us in the future and share some of your insights.
Oh, I've had so much fun with this, and I really want to come back. I always like working with you, and I'm really enjoying your videos.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you. And so for those of you out there, there'll be a link in this video. You can download some free stuff and check back next week. Next week, we're going to talk about performance and learning and how performance and learning are connected. So appreciate all the comments and feedback that's been coming in, and we will chat soon. Thanks all.